Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. You know I love OLED gaming monitors, so I'm back today to check out another OLED option, the Corsair Xeneon 27QHD240. It's always pretty obvious what the specs of a Corsair monitor are just by the name: 27-inch panel size, 1440p QHD resolution, 240Hz refresh rate, and of course being an OLED panel with those specs, we know it's using an LG WOLED panel. So far, I've tested two other monitors that are quite similar to this one and use the same panel, the LG 27GR95QE and the Asus ROG Swift OLED PG27AQDM. There was quite a significant difference in brightness between these two monitors, with the Asus model being around 30 to 40% brighter in HDR scenarios. So it'll be interesting to see where the Corsair model fits in, given its baseline hardware is basically the same. The MSRP for all three models is also quite similar at $1,000 US, so people deciding on a 27-inch OLED gaming monitor have a difficult choice to make. I have seen the Corsair and LG models dip a little below MSRP at times as well, so I'll be sure to break all of that down a bit later on. One of the areas I feel Corsair has really nailed with this monitor is the design. It's simple and doesn't get carried away with gimmicks like RGB LED lighting. Yes, that's right, a high-end Corsair product without RGB, but I think it looks great and it has some genuinely useful features. On the rear of the monitor, for example, all of the ports are easily accessible. They're not tucked away or hard to reach. They point straight out for easy access, which I wish more companies would do. The port selection itself is pretty good, with one DisplayPort 1.4 and two HDMI 2.1 ports, plus a USB hub with four easily accessible Type A ports. The USB-C input also supports DP Alt mode. For 10-bit use, both the DisplayPort and HDMI ports require DSC, as we're only looking at DP 1.4 and HDMI 2.1 with 24 gigabits per second of bandwidth. Not a big issue for those with modern graphics cards that support DSC. The stand is decent with metal legs and a plastic wide-ish pillar. It doesn't take up heaps of space on your desk. It's very sturdy and importantly offers a great range of adjustability, including height, tilt, pivot, and swivel. It also supports phaser mounting, unlike the larger 45-inch adjustable curved OLED from Corsair I looked at a few months back. The OSD also has a neat feature with a proximity sensor that flashes up on screen the locations and functions of the various buttons. There's still a directional toggle here for easy OSD control, but the proximity sensor is genuinely useful for finding where these buttons are located, so you don't have to fumble around trying to find where they are and accidentally switching off the display in the process. The set of features though is only okay. There are a few gamer-specific things like a refresh rate counter and crosshairs, though I would advise against using this on an OLED, but the range of color controls is average and there's only a limited range of OLED care features, just a pixel refresh and screen shifter. As this is now the third monitor that I've tested that uses this LG WOLED panel, the same characteristics are found in this Corsair variant as with the LG and Asus models. This means that, like the others, the Corsair model uses a matte anti-glare coating, which is a reasonably controversial choice among OLED enthusiasts, some of whom prefer a glossy experience, but as I said in my review of the original LG model, I think this is one of the better matte screen coatings. It is on the heavier side, so those that hate any coating grain may not be a huge fan here, but it does do a great job of eliminating reflections, reducing diffuse light, and preserving OLED blacks. And in general, these are my thoughts on matte versus glossy. If you are using this display in a brightly lit room, if there are light sources directly in front of the display, or if you can't control room lighting very well with blinds, a matte coating for an OLED is preferable, and the 27QHD240 looks great in these conditions. In a dimly lit room with some ambient light, or if you can optimize light in the room by putting light sources behind the display or using blinds, a glossy finish is preferable as it will look richer and clearer. In a dark room, like gaming with the lights off, there is almost no difference between glossy and matte, with a slight advantage to glossy as it will have no coating related grain. The WOLED subpixel array is not ideal for desktop use. I think this is a more noticeable issue than past WOLED displays due to the size and resolution of this panel. Previously, we had big 42-inch panels at 4K, which warrant sitting a bit further away and perhaps using resolution scaling. This panel, 27 inches and 1440p, so I suspect people will be sitting closer and using 100% scaling, which exposes the issues with WOLED more significantly. The main concern here is the use of an RWBG layout instead of of traditional RGB, which operating systems expect when rendering text using modern subpixel rendering techniques. WOLED uses that additional white subpixel, which changes the way each color is rendered, and for fine elements like text, that causes a bit of blurriness and almost shadowing relative to a normal RGB subpixel LCD. I don't think it looks very good, and it's a noticeable downgrade over an LCD for text quality. As a result, I don't think this monitor is well suited to desktop use or productivity work, and that's exacerbated by the risk of permanent burn-in when using an OLED for desktop use, which often has a lot of static elements. You shouldn't be concerned about burn-in or the subpixel layout for that matter when using OLED for content consumption like watching videos or playing games, but if you have the same elements on screen for a long period of time, like say the toolbar in an application, that will likely burn in over time, which is why I don't recommend OLED as a productivity monitor. What helps this to some degree is Corsair's best-in-class warranty for their OLED monitor, 3 years, which includes burn-in coverage for that entire period, according to Corsair when I asked them. The LG and Asus monitors both only have 2-year warranties and don't cover burn-in. Motion performance, it is exactly the same from the 27QHD240 as other OLED monitors, so if you've seen my other reviews, this section will not be overly interesting. At 240Hz, this is an extremely fast monitor with an average response time of 0.28 milliseconds, no appreciable overshoot, and excellent cumulative deviation. The only noticeable difference is compared to the LG model, which had a more pronounced period of overshoot that lasts for 1 refresh cycle. The Corsair and Asus models perform essentially identically. We also get excellent numbers across the refresh rate range, as OLED panels do not change in performance at lower refresh rates unlike LCDs. So for variable refresh rate gamers, this is an excellent choice, as you'll get superb performance even at moderate refresh rates like 120Hz. We also don't see any overshoot artifacts at 60Hz, which was a minor issue on the LG equivalent. Compared to other monitors, there really isn't anything separating the 27QHD240 from the other OLEDs. As I said, most are around a 0.3 millisecond average response at 240Hz. This is also true for QD-OLEDs, so don't expect any difference there versus WOLED. The biggest difference is to LCDs, and boy, that is a large difference. The PG27AQN is one of the fastest LCDs around, and even then OLED response times are significantly better. This typically gives OLED an advantage over LCD at the same refresh rate, allowing for similar motion performance to an LCD at a lower refresh. I think 240Hz OLED and 360Hz LCD is pretty similar visually, with the 360Hz LCD only slightly better. Similar story in other performance charts. OLEDs have great performance across the refresh rate range, as OLEDs can maintain the same level of speed at any refresh rate. In contrast, LCDs typically get slower as the refresh rate decreases, or they produce more overshoot. So when we look at average cumulative deviation, OLEDs hold a significant lead over LCDs on average, and like the other graphs, the Corsair monitor is no different to others using the same tech. The 27QHD240 is a great monitor for 120Hz gaming, even though it is a 240Hz monitor. So if you want to pair this with a game console and play at 1440p 120Hz, that's a very suitable choice. 60Hz performance is also excellent, although due to the sample and hold nature of OLEDs, there will still be some level of blur here that you won't get at higher refresh rates. Input latency, it's excellent from the 27QHD240 with a processing lag of just 0.2 milliseconds, in line with other WOLED panels. This is a super responsive monitor to use. It feels fast, the refresh rate is high, and the time it takes to transition is low, great for multiplayer or latency sensitive gaming. Power consumption is lower from this Corsair monitor compared to the Asus and LG models. You'll see here the Corsair tops out around 40 watts compared to 50 to 55 watts for the other models. This is simply because the Corsair model is dimmer in SDR content and is unable to reach 200 nits of brightness, whereas the LG and Asus models can achieve that 200 nit rating. I won't spoil the brightness result, which appears later in the review, but essentially when brightness is lower on an OLED, so is power use. Like other OLED monitors on the market, this Corsair variant does not support backlight strobing / black frame insertion. While it looks great at 240Hz and does have a clarity advantage over a non-strobed LCD at the same refresh rate, the best clarity is still only achievable on LCDs with strobing. The PG27AQN and XL2566K are some examples of high-end monitors with excellent motion clarity through strobing, which beats the 27QHD240 and offers a higher refresh rate as well. Until OLEDs support some sort of strobing, this will continue to be the case, although strobing is not very compatible with, say, variable refresh rates, so these results are only possible at fixed refreshes. I think for people like playing single player games, you're probably going to be using the VRR mode, so these sorts of discussions aren't that relevant. Color performance is next up, and we already know what this panel brings from a color space standpoint, as it's the same panel as other models. So getting 97% DCI-P3 coverage isn't a huge surprise, and is in line with our results from the ASUS and LG variants. This led to 72% coverage of Rec 2020, which is right on the expected amount for a WOLED panel, and it's just fine for HDR content, though not quite as good as those QD-OLEDs. Factory calibration is pretty typical from the 27QHD240 among gaming monitors, but much better than both the ASUS and LG variants. Corsair have decided to aim for a much more accurate 6500K color temperature in the monitor's default mode, and while they don't quite hit that, it's far more accurate than the other options, which have noticeable blue tints and bad Delta E performance. Even with the wonky gamma performance, at least for grayscale, the Corsair variant is significantly better tuned than the other brands straight from the box. Saturation and color checker results are not amazing though, as this monitor does not ship with a gamut clamp enabled by default, so normal SDR content will be oversaturated to some degree. When we look at comparison charts, the Corsair is mid-table for grayscale, but clearly ahead of the LG and ASUS, which sit at the bottom. Color checker delivers a better ranking, again ahead of the other options. For sRGB use, the 27QHD240 does come with an sRGB mode, which is pretty good. Gamma performance could be better for brighter shades, but overall the level of accuracy is above average and again superior to what LG and ASUS deliver. This continues through the saturation and color checker tests, meaning the sRGB mode is quite well suited to everyday usage, and it does allow for color temperature and brightness adjustments. However, I wasn't really able to achieve much better performance through further hardware tweaks. The next main step for a calibration is a full run through CalMan and the creation of an ICC profile. OLEDs are a little trickier to calibrate than LCDs generally. The performance can vary depending on certain conditions, but still the performance here is good, and for P3 work, the near full coverage does allow for reasonable accuracy. While Corsair are able to offer a better level of calibration than their competitors, a main weakness of this monitor is brightness for SDR content. The LG equivalent is able to produce at least 198 nits for all window sizes, including full screen white, and the ASUS model is up in QD-OLED territory with 243 nits full screen. However, the 27QHD240 is just a 131 nit monitor for full screen content, matching the Xeneon Flex and several other WOLED monitors. This is a very disappointing result that makes the Corsair monitor much less suited to SDR usage. For brightness, this display comes with two modes, so to speak, the standard mode, which has an automatic brightness limiter, and the brightness stabilizer mode, which disables the ABL and limits the panel to a consistent level of brightness across all window sizes. Neither is a great solution. With the brightness stabilizer disabled, the monitor is brighter and can reach well above 131 nits, but the level of brightness will change depending on the average picture level, or APL. Brighter and larger windows that use a lot of white will see brightness drop, but when you shrink those windows, brightness will go up. That's pretty annoying behavior for a desktop, and even in this mode, full screen white is still around that 130 nit mark. With the brightness stabilizer on, brightness is capped to around a 150 nit maximum, with a small drop off to 131 nits for full screen content. So it doesn't fully disable the ABL, but it does drastically reduce how aggressive it is. 130 to 150 nits will be fine for some users, especially in darker environments, but it's not exactly very bright. And it's quite a lot dimmer than its competitors using the same panel, who also have similar uniform brightness modes. I'm really not sure why Corsair weren't able to hit the brightness of other monitors using the same panel. It's definitely a huge disappointment. Another annoyance is that the brightness stabilizer setting is independent of the HDR setting, so it will remain enabled when you switch from the SDR to HDR mode. I prefer using the stabilizer in the SDR mode, but HDR doesn't work well at all with it enabled, so I'd want to turn it off, which meant every time I switch modes, I also had to go and change the brightness stabilizer setting. Really, this setting should be linked to the operating mode of the monitor to save that annoyance. As for minimum brightness, it's fine at 31 nits, as are black levels, which as expected are effectively infinite due to the OLED panel's ability to switch off pixels to show black. Viewing angles are also excellent on this OLED, as we've come to expect from this technology. You can basically view this display from any angle and get a great experience, plus it's a flat panel, so there's no issues arising from any curve. Uniformity though was a bit less impressive. While an OLED cannot suffer from backlight bleed or IPS glow, my unit did have a bit of a dirty screen effect when viewing grey content, which is where you can see some grey uniformity issues viewing mid-dark tones relative to an LCD that shows these tones in a more consistent fashion. While white uniformity overall was excellent, the 27QHD240 isn't that good for apps that have dark grey backgrounds, which is surprisingly quite a few of them. Both the LG and Asus variants also had this issue, so it seems that this WOLED panel fundamentally suffers from this problem due to its hardware. This Corsair monitor is an excellent HDR display. This is due to OLED technology's inherent hardware qualities that are tailor-made for displaying HDR content. The key feature here is that each individual pixel is self-lit, meaning at a pixel level, the display can turn on or off to accurately display everything from dark shadows to bright highlights. When the display needs to show pure black, it can fully switch off, giving us the trademark rich zero-level blacks and deep shadows that OLED is known for. This is in contrast to most HDR-capable LCD panels, which are not fully controllable at the pixel level. LCDs require a backlight, and for HDR displays, this typically means the use of full-array local dimming, a technology that splits the backlight into zones. Whereas OLED can turn off each pixel individually, LCDs with local dimming can only turn off certain zones encompassing hundreds or even thousands of pixels. This can still be effective for HDR content and look great, but it has some fundamental flaws in difficult circumstances. For example, when showing a bright and dark element close together, an OLED can control each pixel as needed with a clean, accurate distinction between bright and dark. LCDs with local dimming need to masterfully control the zones to achieve the necessary distinction between bright and dark, and when the element is too small or not in the optimal position, the bright element can spill into the dark area within the backlight zone, creating ugly, blooming artifacts. OLED therefore has the edge when it comes to displaying clean HDR content with minimal blooming or haloing. In some scenes, this will be the difference between raised blacks and deep blacks, such as for star fields and Christmas lights. At other times, OLED can have a brightness advantage for small bright objects within a dark scene. Subtitles will look cleaner on an OLED with reduced blooming, and generally OLEDs produce richer shadows thanks to its inherently higher contrast ratio. Aside from brightness and shadow detail, OLEDs also have other advantages for HDR. As there are no backlight zones, OLEDs are faster to transition between bright and dark with no visible zone transitions. OLEDs are much less likely to suffer from backlight flickering, although light PWM behavior, especially when using a variable refresh rate, is common. And OLEDs like this one do not increase input latency in its HDR mode, as they don't need to run a backlight zone algorithm. The downside to HDR on an OLED is brightness. OLEDs typically don't get as bright as an LCD with full array local dimming in HDR content, especially for large window sizes. This is true for the 27QHD240, but luckily HDR brightness isn't as bad as in the SDR mode. For example, full screen brightness is poor, but it's no worse than the LG equivalent, though behind the Asus model. 10% window brightness is basically identical to the LG model, and behind the Asus model, which in this test ends up about 35% brighter. And I should note this is with a similar 6500K color temperature. The Asus model is not cheating via white balance tweaks. Brightness versus window size shows that the 27QHD240 using optimal HDR settings, the standard color temperature mode, not the blue tinted default mode, performs just like the 27GR95QE, except at lower APLs where the Corsair is a bit brighter. Brightness at most window sizes is below the Asus model. This raises the question of how Corsair can claim 1000 nits of brightness. Well, to achieve this, you have to alter the white balance to be far less accurate using the default mode, then test it using a 3% window size. When I did this, I got 950 nits of brightness, which is still short of 1000 nits and not a very practical way to use the monitor, as the blue tint is very noticeable and not accurate. But hey, if you are desperate, near 1000 nits is technically possible. For real scene brightness, the Corsair monitor is not good in video scene 1, but it is better in scene 2, nearly matching the LG model. Once again, this is still far behind what the Asus model can do. While gaming, the maximum I recorded was around 600 nits, slightly better than the LG, but the Asus model is almost 40% brighter under the same test conditions. While SDR accuracy is very good, HDR accuracy is not so much. Performance on AMD and Nvidia GPUs is identical, but EOTF tracking is off with weird, almost linear performance where it should be following a curve. This means that in some scenarios this monitor will be too bright, while in others it will be too dim, relative to what it should be. This is disappointing as the ASUS model now has perfect tracking after its latest firmware update, while the LG is also very good. Color performance in the HDR mode is also not amazing. There are both saturation and luminance issues leading to weak delta E's. Final section of this review is the Hub Essentials checklist. Corsair do pretty well in the first couple of sections, including HDMI 2.1, unlike the ASUS version, and also offering good factory calibration despite not advertising it. However, the color space I recorded is a bit lower than advertised, and while Corsair do show 450 nits of brightness, it's unclear whether this means SDR or HDR brightness. It's true for HDR and not true for SDR, so I've given them the benefit of the doubt. 0.03 millisecond response time advertising, in my opinion, is unnecessary and not reflective of how the panel actually performs, even though performance is very good. 0.1 milliseconds would have been borderline okay here. As for HDR performance, great results here as this is a true HDR panel, with the exception of brightness, which is advertised as 1000 nits but cannot hit this under realistic test conditions. There's also the problem of the RWBG subpixel layout and risk of permanent burn-in, although other issues were not found, and the monitor does support firmware updates for future support and improvements. Overall, the Corsair Xeneon 27QHD240 is a pretty good OLED gaming monitor, though I do have some question marks over whether it's the best of the three variants I've tested so far. What's actually surprised me throughout these reviews is just how different each model is, sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes in more obvious ways. It's not always the case we see big differences between monitors using the same panel hardware. What's good to confirm is that we get all the usual great benefits of OLED from this monitor. Motion performance is identical to other OLED offerings, meaning it's outstanding for fast-paced gaming, only beaten by the very best strobed LCDs. This gives the 27QHD240 excellent versatility for both multiplayer gaming at 1440p 240Hz, as well as stunning single-player gaming in the HDR mode. If you're the sort of gamer that plays a wide variety of games, this sort of monitor is really best in class for that use case. We also get the deep black levels we know and love from OLED, as well as its per pixel local dimming for excellent HDR characteristics. It does have the same panel coding and subpixel layout as other WOLEDs though, which isn't ideal for desktop usage and could be a bit heavy on the coding side for those that love glossy monitors, although I personally find the coding fine. There are some aspects to this monitor that Corsair does especially well relative to the competition. Factory calibration in the SDR mode is decent, especially for the sRGB mode, which is above average and much better than the ASUS and LG equivalents. I like the easy access ports, the inclusion of HDMI 2.1, and the proximity detection feature for the OSD. That's pretty neat. Corsair are also the only of the three brands tested so far that offers a comprehensive 3-year warranty that includes burn-in. Neither LG nor ASUS specify burn-in coverage for their models, so this Corsair is best for those that need that peace of mind, although there is still a risk of burn-in and we don't recommend this monitor for productivity work. Aside from these benefits though, I think there are too many other downsides to get a strong recommendation. Brightness is definitely the biggest drawback. This monitor is substantially dimmer than the LG and ASUS models in the SDR mode, and while it's similar to the LG in the HDR mode and overall HDR brightness is okay, the ASUS model is simply the best for brightness. Given OLEDs aren't known for stellar brightness, I feel this is a really key selling point for the PG27AQDM and subsequently quite a large negative for the Corsair model. I could probably live with weaker brightness, but it's further impacted by underwhelming HDR accuracy, well behind the largely accurate LG and ASUS variants. I hope Corsair fix this through a software update, as well as address the annoying brightness stabilizer behavior. Unfortunately, the end result is the HDR experience isn't as good as it could be, considering the OLED panel used here. And given top-tier HDR is really why you'd buy a product like this, I'd be more likely to buy the LG and especially ASUS variants instead. But it's not a terrible product. These downsides are not total deal breakers. Things like HDR accuracy can be addressed through a firmware update, and its brightness isn't disastrous for HDR gaming. What it does mean though is that Corsair can't price the monitor at the same level as the LG and ASUS variants. At $1,000 it's matching the others right now, and at that price I would simply recommend the ASUS PG27AQDM. However, I have seen the Corsair for as low as $950, while the LG variant has hit $900. So it's good to see there is some wiggle room on price to keep things competitive. We are talking about high-end monitors though. I feel like a lot of buyers would just stump up the extra $50 to $100 to get the best variant. So based on that, I think Corsair need to undercut ASUS maybe around the $850 to $900 mark. Would get the job done, probably more like $850. I'm not sure. Let me know what you think in the comments below. That sort of pricing is also likely to differ between regions. For example, here in Australia, the Corsair is coming in at 1,750 Australian dollars, while the ASUS is a whopping $2,000. So that certainly swings things more in favor of Corsair. Anyway, that's it for this review of the 27QHD240. If you are interested in this monitor or the other OLEDs that we're talking about, or just any other monitor, we do have links to their current pricing in the description below, so check that out. Also, if you want to support our independent testing of products like this and our monitor content, then please do subscribe to Monitors Unboxed, and also consider supporting us through our Patreon and Floatplane accounts. Links to those are in the description. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.